Hi everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on best practice in legal outreach, presented by Maroske. I'd like to acknowledge, along with Community Legal Centres Queensland and LawRight, the traditional owners of the land on which we are holding this webinar, in Brisbane, the Turrbal and Yagara people. We pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge the important role Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders continue to play in our society. As this presentation is being viewed by people across Queensland and Australia, we also pay our respects to the traditional owners of the land throughout the country and extend a warm welcome to any First Australians listening today. We also acknowledge the importance of legal outreach to First Nations communities in rural and remote Queensland, and that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples frequently face structural disadvantage when engaging with the justice system. This presentation is for professional development and education purposes only and is not intended to provide legal advice. It is not to be used for commercial purposes without the express permission of the author. Information is current as of the 17th of June 2019. Today we are fortunate to have Maroske as our presenter. His presentation will be valuable for any lawyers working in outreach services, for service providers planning to implement new legal outreach projects, and for anyone else who is interested. It will cover the skills necessary to build effective working relationships with non-legal assistance services, to engage meaningfully with vulnerable clients, and to ensure that outreach legal services are delivered effectively and appropriately. I'll hand over to Kurt and talk to you again at the end of this session.
Thanks for that, Amanda. And good morning, everyone. Thanks for tuning in to today's webinar on best practice in legal outreach. As covered in the introduction, my name is Kurt Maroske, and I'm a project officer with LawRight's Homeless Persons Legal Clinic, where I'm fortunate enough to research topics like the ones we're discussing today. And I also coordinate LawRight's weekly outreach clinic to Roma House, which is a supported accommodation service that's run by Mission Australia here in Brisbane. So for the past 12 months in my role at LawRight, I've been researching best practice in legal outreach, and I'm here today to share some of that research with all of you. I will mention at the outset that what I'm covering today is really a condensed version of some resources that LawRight have recently published. So sadly, we won't have time to cover everything in as much depth as I'd like, but if you'd appreciate, I guess, going a bit deeper into the topics at hand, then please visit the LawRight website and check out the reports that are there. So to tell you a little bit about LawRight's outreach project, so in 2018, LawRight was funded by the Queensland Legal Assistance Forum to investigate legal outreach in the Queensland context, and particularly in a way that accounts for Queensland's unique geography. So we consulted with 18 lawyers who work in legal outreach to hear about the amazing projects they're delivering and to draw on their experiences. If you're one of the lawyers that we consulted with and are here viewing the webinar today, then I'd like to thank you immensely for your time and for your insights. And I hope that you appreciate that I'm sharing some of those views with everyone today. So after we consulted with the services that we spoke to, we did a thorough review of Australian and international literature around legal outreach specifically, and also about engagement with marginalised clients more generally. And as I mentioned, we produced a suite of resources called the Best Practice Guide to Legal Outreach, which are available online. So today we're going to be talking about, I'll give you a little bit more information about that project, but then we'll get into the content where we'll be talking about what we mean by outreach in the context of legal assistance. We'll discuss why we do legal outreach and the outcomes that outreach can lead to for clients, and particularly for vulnerable and marginalised clients. We'll be looking at how to do legal outreach from the perspective of service design, and with a particular focus on collaboration with non-legal assistance services in your area. And then we're going to briefly be looking at the legal and non-legal skills that are important when lawyers are working in this space. So I won't get a chance to dive into things as deeply as I'd really like to, but if there is something that you'd like to talk about in a bit more depth, or you'd like to stop and provide your insights and your experiences on, or there's a particular sort of point of tension that's, I guess, inherent in doing legal outreach, and there's quite a lot of those, then please use the webinar software to communicate that to Amanda, and she'll flag that with me, and we'll be able to discuss that a little bit further. So before I get really into the content, I will just dwell for a moment on the consultations that we conducted last year to create this research. And you can see on your screen a breakdown of the 18 consultations that we conducted. It might be a little bit difficult to read on your screen. Hopefully it comes across on the webinar software. But we performed 18 consultations, and we had a good mix of metropolitan and regional-based services. We spoke to services that use pro bono contributions from firms and those that rely entirely on in-house lawyers. And we spoke to specialist services with expertise in outreach to homeless populations, to rural and remote communities, to health justice partnerships, youth services, women's services, First Nations communities. And we really tried to incorporate all of that knowledge and all of that expertise into the resources we created, and also into the webinar that we're presenting today. And really the main takeaway that I had from the consultations was the diversity of truly effective outreach programs that are being delivered in Queensland, not just in terms of the target demographic, but also their service model, how they engage with clients, how they engage with community. And we'll be touching on some of those different approaches throughout the webinar, but I think it's really important to keep in mind that outreach by its nature is something that's going to be very tailored. It's going to be something that's very specific, and there's really not a one-size-fits-all model. It's something that, when it's done well, is very context-specific, and yeah, it is very sort of customized for the people and the communities that you're going to be reaching. So before we talk too much about legal outreach, we should really discuss what we mean by legal outreach. And for the purpose of the webinar today, we define legal outreach as services which make proactive attempts to reach their clients rather than waiting for clients to come to them. Services which deliver legal advice and assistance outside of a provider's primary office. So a service that will travel to a neighbourhood centre or a community agency or a hospital and provide legal assistance there. And so as an upshot of that, outreach services enhance accessibility for legal assistance to the target client group. And to some extent, necessarily they collaborate with non-legal community agencies, whether that's a health service or a housing service or what have you. And I think the last of those points is particularly important because, as we'll discuss later in the webinar, collaboration with non-legal services is absolutely vital. It's just absolutely critical for the delivery of legal outreach, particularly outreach to vulnerable and marginalised populations. During our consultation, every one of the 18 community legal services that we spoke to was in partnership to some extent with a community organisation, a neighbourhood centre, a hospital, or a similar organisation. I should also clarify that during this webinar, when we're talking about legal outreach, I'm specifically talking about services which provide legal information, advice and assistance, and or which connect with clients to provide them with legal representation. So we're not just talking about community legal education projects, although obviously there's a lot of crossover, and a lot of outreach services also deliver CLE. So why do we do legal outreach? There's really a number of answers to that question, and so we'll have a look at some of them in turn. So firstly, and most importantly, outreach provides legal assistance to vulnerable clients, or at least access to legal assistance to vulnerable clients. So for people who are experiencing marginalisation and disadvantage, whether that's due to geographic isolation, to disability, to poverty, or any number of other factors, those people are far more likely to experience legal problems than the broader population. And when I say far more likely, the discrepancy is really quite vast. So in the 2012 Legal Australia-wide survey, the Laws survey, found that in Queensland, and I think the numbers are quite similar interstate, but in Queensland, 10% of people accounted for 68% of all legal problems. So really a very small minority of people account for the majority of legal problems. And so if we couple that with the fact that marginalised clients are unlikely to have the knowledge and the capacity and the resources to proactively seek out legal assistance for a number of reasons, which we'll discuss in more detail later, you can see that this creates a situation where the people who are most in need of legal assistance are often the least likely to seek it out. And I'll be peppering this presentation with quotes from our consultations, and here you can see a Brisbane-based lawyer who delivers outreach to refugees and asylum seekers, emphasising the importance of being proactive and making sure that vulnerable clients have access to justice. So outreach lets us reach vulnerable people and communities and to provide them with legal assistance, but moreover, it lets us do it in a way that's targeted and tailored to a certain population's specific needs and their circumstances and their capabilities. So there are a wide range of legal outreach models used by services throughout Queensland and throughout the world that are tailored to fit a specific target client group and to the context of their particular local community. So for instance, a service for refugees and asylum seekers in the inner city is probably going to have a different approach to outreach than a women's service that visits remote communities. So the strengths of this tailored approach are that the service as a whole and the individual lawyers there will have an in-depth knowledge of the target client group and know how to engage effectively with that group and with those clients. They'll understand the legal and non-legal problems that their clients face and their barriers to addressing those problems. They'll have experience working with those clients to break down those barriers, and they'll have the expertise to have a well-developed response that accords with best practice. So one of our consultees put this really succinctly by noting that outreach is not a one-size-fits-all model. So the next reason that legal outreach is important is that it lets us be where our clients are. So when people, particularly vulnerable people, experience a legal issue, their first response isn't always to actively seek legal assistance. And a lot of people won't even characterize a legal problem as a legal problem. So to draw on an example from our practice, from the Homeless Persons Legal Clinic, when a person receives a notice, for example, to leave their rental property, they'll often see that as a personal and a financial and a practical problem rather than necessarily a legal problem, even though it's something that a lawyer can almost certainly assist with. So when people encounter a legal problem like this, rather than consulting with a lawyer, their first approach to resolving the issue is often to speak to a non-legal professional. Or they might try directly communicating with the other party, they might consult a friend or a relative, or they might just try to fix the situation themselves through websites or other self-help guides. But often people will seek help from a non-legal professional. So the Laws Survey, once again, found that in Queensland, a legal professional was consulted in only 30% of cases where someone sought advice for a legal problem. And there are several reasons that people turn to non-legal services, like the ones you can see on screen. It might be that the service is familiar to them, that it's known and trusted, that it's perceived to be accessible and approachable. And of course, the flip side to that is that legal services are often seen by people to be inaccessible and unapproachable. But more than that, people will often just seek help from the person that they're already in contact with when a problem comes up. So if someone's in contact with a domestic violence counsellor when they get evicted, then that counsellor's probably going to be the first person they speak to about the eviction, even though they might not be best positioned to help. So these kinds of non-legal workers, because they're often the only support structures that vulnerable people have in their lives, they're ideally placed to notice legal problems and to refer their clients to lawyers, and they're also ideal targets for outreach. And as I mentioned at the top of the presentation, every outreach service that LawRight spoke to as part of this research was connected in with non-legal services and provided outreach to those locations. And the benefits of doing that is that it lets outreach service providers intervene before a problem reaches crisis point, and it lets us engage with clients before their issues become far more serious and difficult to resolve. So if, for example, your service is co-located at a neighbourhood centre, you're far more likely to already be connected with a client around the time that a legal issue presents itself, like the eviction example previously, and then you can take steps from there. So it's much better when someone gets the notice to leave their rental property, that they're already connected to your outreach service, and then you can take steps immediately before the crisis escalates. And that's obviously a far better situation than a client calling up a community legal centre or legal aid 2 days before their eviction or 2 days before their court or tribunal hearing and hoping for assistance, which I'm sure is a situation that you're all familiar with. So I understand that, the phrase early intervention is used as a bit of a buzzword sometimes, but it's really meaningful to vulnerable clients. They have that support in place early. So the last note I'll mention about why outreach is important, and particularly in the Queensland context, is that it helps to meet the needs of remote communities. So we know that people in remote communities have a disproportionately high number of legal issues and typically have very little access to legal assistance. So outreach is absolutely vital. So to give some sense of the distances that people have to travel to legal services, the last time I gave this presentation on this topic, I cited a statistic that said that people in remote communities often travel upwards of 80 kilometres to find legal assistance. And someone came up to me afterwards and tapped me on the shoulder and with a bit of a chuckle said, 80 kilometres, try 300. And that was someone who does work in legal outreach in far north Queensland. And so as you can see, without outreach, these communities, some people really don't have any access to legal assistance, and access to any sort of justice for them is entirely theoretical. And I think it's specifically important to mention that remote Torres Strait Islander and Aboriginal communities in particular are important targets for legal outreach due to the high level of unaddressed legal need, their isolation from many services, legal and non-legal, and the considerable disadvantage that Australia's first people face when engaging with the justice system. And that need has been quite widely recognised in the literature, of course. So now that we've discussed the whys of legal outreach, let's look at how we do legal outreach effectively. And there's really a number of answers to that question. So if there's one takeaway that people get from this webinar, and I know that if you're listening to the webinar, then you're probably either a legal outreach practitioner or you're an academic that looks at working with vulnerable and marginalised people. And so I definitely don't want to tell you how to do your job or tell you something that you already know. But the most valuable takeaway, I think, is the importance of collaboration in legal outreach. So vulnerable people tend to have this complex web of legal and non-legal issues that are all connected to each other, and it's not really possible to resolve any of those issues by any single agency or service. So, for example, at our homeless persons legal clinic, it's not uncommon to find a client who's in insecure housing, who might also have a history of family violence, and also has an experience of living with a disability or a mental illness. So for a person in that situation, it's important to be connected with mental health services, to be connected with crisis accommodation service or a social housing provider, and also to be connected to us to try to resolve their legal issues. But the truth is that these issues aren't easy, or in some cases even possible, to resolve in isolation. So where possible, all of these services should be communicating and working together and collaborating to try to provide a coordinated approach to resolving that person's legal and non-legal problems. The truth is too, selfishly, that as a lawyer, your job becomes a lot easier if some of the background issues are addressed. So if your client has a roof over their head and is receiving support for addiction or illness and has some stability and security in their life, then you're far more likely to be able to maintain contact with that client and to achieve some positive legal outcomes. So some ways that you can promote this collaborative practice with other services is to have formalized, structured channels of communicating with them, preferably formalized through a memoranda of understanding or other documents, and to engage in regular planning sessions, meetings, and other structured forms of communication so that you can have that coordinated response. And it's also important to genuinely collaborate on programs that assist your clients, and recognizing that even though your service might be bringing legal skills and legal knowledge, that other professionals like nurses and social workers, psychologists, etc., they will have valuable skills and expertise that can improve the lives of your clients and make your life as a lawyer easier. You can also improve and promote collaboration by having well-connected networks of services in your area so that you know who to turn to for advice and referrals, and making sure to nurture those networks through interagency meetings, through forums, committees, and other ways to bring your staff together to familiarize yourself with the work that each other does and to know how to provide that holistic, coordinated response. You can also improve your collaboration through shared training and PD sessions with your partner agencies, and for your service to deliver training to them and vice versa. We might discuss this last aspect in a bit more detail later in the webinar if we get some time, but it's definitely very helpful if the agencies that you collaborate with have a bit of an understanding about the areas of law that you work in and how you can assist your clients, and conversely that you have an understanding of the way they support your clients and how those can kind of complement one another. So on the topic of collaboration, one of the consultees from our consultation mentioned that the best way to connect clients is to go down there on the ground in person with staff members from their support agencies, and that will result in a better uptake of people accessing your service. So I've just been mentioning the importance of multidisciplinary collaboration, and the literature identifies that this approach allows for a broad range of legal issues to be resolved. More importantly, it means that the onus isn't on clients to actively have to go out and proactively connect with a heap of different services and to be passed around on the referral carousel, because we all know that's how clients can slip through the cracks if they're constantly getting passed from service to service. And I think that's a really important point to spend a bit of time on. We all know that when people are experiencing vulnerability and they're in personal distress, when they're in legal crisis, the last thing they want to do is track down a new service provider and have to start explaining their story from scratch and building rapport all over again. So it's much easier if there's a one-stop shop where they're known and they feel welcomed and they can go to for support. And that just makes everyone's job a lot easier from the professional's perspective, but it also makes it a lot less intimidating from the client's perspective. And really that's what legal outreach is all about. It's about recognizing that people have these multifaceted, interconnected problems, that we're there to add the legal knowledge that helps them to resolve their problems, but that really a person is, they're coming to see your service because they're in a state of emergency, and that's something that you can provide one element of the support for, but that really is almost certainly going to require a more comprehensive approach. So it's important when you're taking this collaborative approach to outreach that you provide training to your partner agencies, whether that's through formal structured training programs or just informal discussions, staff meetings, etc. Just conversations outside the legal clinic, and that you're upskilling the agencies that you work with. There's really a number of benefits to that. Firstly, it helps staff to identify the legal dimension of their clients' problems and to know when to refer them to your service. It also helps them to know whether your service is the right place to refer a person or whether there's somewhere else that might be more appropriate. So if your partner agency staff have a broad general knowledge of what the legal assistance landscape looks like locally, then they're more likely to be able to refer in a timely and effective manner and in a way that is in the best interests of their clients. I'll also mention here too that if you train the agencies you're collaborating with to use tools like the legal health check, that lets the non-legal staff assess a client's legal needs and to pass that on to you before your first appointment with the client, then that can really help dramatically to, get to the core of the client's issue, knowing that you might only have a limited amount of time that you can spend with them. And I guess finally on this topic, I'll mention that when you're providing training to your partner agency staff, that shows them that you're committed to the service and shows them that you're committed to collaborating with them and to positive outcomes for their clients, which means that it's more likely to help build trust and rapport between your services and to just make those connections a lot more solid and to just make that collaboration a lot more concrete. So this doesn't really fit in nicely anywhere in the rest of the webinar, so it's probably a good place to talk about it now, which is to think strategically about the way that you use technology if you're doing outreach. And what I mean by that is that a lot of outreach services, there's a lot of discussion of it in the literature in recent years, is the use of technology like Skype, video conferencing services, I guess the type of technology that we're using today for the webinar to deliver legal outreach, particularly in the context of regional and remote Queensland, where there's some of those just vast geographic distances to cover. And during the consultations for this project, a lot of people had some real issues with video conferencing technology as a mode of legal outreach delivery. And so I think it's important just to reflect on some of those. So I guess the first point of reflection is that a lot of people, particularly marginalised people, particularly older people or people who have a disability, people who have mental illness, can find technology really difficult to use. They can find it uncomfortable to sort of operate in a digital space, and so might not find video conferencing particularly easy to use or particularly accessible, particularly if there isn't a staff member or a counsellor or support worker at the other end with them to help facilitate that technology. And by operating your outreach through sort of a video-based or a technology-based approach, that really diminishes the ability for a legal practitioner to build rapport with their client. So much of legal outreach is about gaining that client's trust and being able to kind of break down those barriers, and that can be really hard when you then add the artificial barrier of a screen between you and your client. We had a lot of services report that the technology used for that kind of outreach wasn't necessarily reliable, part of that due to lack of funding, lack of resourcing in the community legal space, and some of it just due to Australia's technology infrastructure not always being reliable. And so, if you're working with a client who might not have a huge amount of trust in the legal system and in authority to begin with, and they've managed to be persuaded to come in and to meet with you to resolve their legal problems, then any sort of confidence that you might have is going to be eroded very quickly when you see that you can't hear what they're saying, the line keeps dropping out. So it can be a really tricky sort of line to walk when you're providing that kind of outreach. And I guess fundamentally, the last thing to think about if you're thinking of planning a technology-based approach to outreach is that, as discussed, it's really just fundamentally important to have a strong working relationship with the organizations that you're collaborating with. That's the best way to promote uptake to your service. That's the best way to provide a coordinated response to your client's needs. And if you're not going down to have a physical presence with the agencies that you're collaborating with, then obviously that's going to create some impediments to being able to build a strong working relationship with them, to building rapport with them, and to and as such to being able to holistically support your clients. So despite all the negativity that I've just thrown at you, I'm not saying that technology-based outreach should be necessarily avoided. For a lot of places in Australia, it's just a geographic reality that it's going to be the only approach to outreach that that is feasible. But I just think it's really important to consider some of those factors and to make sure that you're weighing them up and that you build in some workarounds into your service model, just to be able to address some of the barriers that technology-based outreach necessarily imposes on you. So for a lot of the people who are tuning in today, this is probably the section of the webinar that they're most interested in, which is the skills, the legal and non-legal skills that are important to a lawyer that's working in the outreach space. And I know that a lot of you probably are lawyers working in this space. So once again, I'm not trying to tell you how to do your job, but here are some considerations that might be worth reflecting on. So really there's three broad areas of skill and knowledge that an outreach lawyer requires. So firstly, obviously, like any legal practitioner, you need to have competence in the areas of law that you're working in. You also need to know how to effectively engage with clients with complex needs. And we know that a lot of the people who engage with an outreach service are going to be people that face vulnerability, people that face marginalisation, and that by their nature will have some barriers to engagement that won't necessarily be there in a commercial setting. And as discussed, it's also really important that outreach lawyers can build relationships with the services that they're visiting and with the staff that they're collaborating with. So on the screen, you'll see a list of the areas of law that vulnerable clients tend to experience, and as such that often arise in an outreach legal practice. So obviously, not every legal practitioner that works in outreach is going to have the necessary experience across all of these areas of law. Maybe if you're from a larger and more well-funded service, you might have someone on your staff that's an expert in all of those areas. But, given the nature of the sector, it's probably far more likely that you'll only have expertise in a few or a number of those areas. But these are the issues that clients are, by their nature, going to come to see you about. And so it's important to have a broad general understanding of what those areas look like. And even if you're not in a position to be able to give advice on that particular area, to at least give some practical advice, or to know who to refer someone to, or to be able to kind of provide that other type of support for your clients. Because often you're going to be the only pathway to legal assistance that they have. So it's important that you don't just throw your hands up in the air and say, oh, sorry, that's a criminal law issue. We don't help with that. So, for instance, at the homeless person's legal clinic, we're a civil law practice, and often people will come to see us when they have a criminal charge because, they just hear we're lawyers and we're here to help homeless people, which is true. And even though we can't give direct advice on a criminal issue, we'll at least sort of help them through some of the practical steps, or we'll do our best to connect them with a criminal lawyer. But beyond knowing about the areas of law, it's really important to understand compounding disadvantage and the way that marginalisation impacts a client's ability to engage with your service. So as we discussed earlier in the webinar, legal problems aren't equally distributed through the population. The people who are likely to engage with your service are almost certainly likely to have more legal problems than the broader population, and they're also probably likely to have more severe and more complex legal problems. And there's a strong sort of cyclical relationship between socioeconomic disadvantage and legal problems. It doesn't take too much imagination to think of an example where a person who is living in, social housing or an insecure housing situation, for instance, encounters a legal problem that causes them a great deal of stress and personal hardship and distress, and that aggravates their existing mental health concern, and that might cause them to miss a rental payment or to jeopardize their tenancy, which then again causes them stress. If they end up having to sleep rough for a while, that opens them up to charges of public nuisance or to public transport fare evasion, and it just creates this cycle where a legal problem creates a social or an economic problem, and that cycle just perpetuates itself. And there's any number of studies that show that even for people who might be more middle class, might be more established, might be more secure, that experience legal problems, that causes just a great deal of personal and emotional distress. And for a person who is already living on the margins, that distress can really just be quite devastating and can really endanger someone's life and someone's well-being. So it's important to understand, the ways that a legal problem might aggravate a social problem or jeopardize someone's economic situation, and then there's the potential for that just to spiral to a certain extent. So when we're talking about marginalisation, we're really talking about certain groups of people who have a certain shared experience that might lead them to lack of engagement, lack of civic engagement, lack of socioeconomic participation, and that as such leads to a high proportion of legal problems. And of course, it's important to note that a person might fall into, or is very likely to fall into, more than one of the categories that I'm showing on screen at the moment. So, for instance, you might meet a person who's an older gay man who's sleeping rough, or you might meet a woman who's living in a remote community who has a low level of literacy and is experiencing domestic or family violence. And each of those issues in isolation might create some barriers to engagement with your service and with services in general, to participating in society in general. And it's really important that lawyers understand not only those issues in isolation, but also how they all overlap and intersect with each other to create these these multifaceted webs of barriers to engagement. So we're really, when we're talking about marginalisation, we're talking about sort of compound marginalisation. And as someone from one of our consultations mentioned, it's not just the DV itself that makes a person vulnerable. There's also literacy issues, disability, they're from a low socioeconomic background. And yeah, as this person succinctly put it, it's not just one vulnerability, it's everything. So even people who are operating services to, I guess, the more general community, by the nature of them accessing a CLC, it's very likely that they're at least sort of economically disadvantaged in some way, but may very likely be facing other barriers. And just to spend a bit more time on that, because I think we have a little bit more time. It's really important to recognise that a lot of people who experience marginalisation have just a great level of distrust in in the legal system and in bureaucracy in general and in the justice system. People might have had quite poor experiences previously in their engagement with the legal system. They might be from a community that has historically faced real barriers in accessing justice, or may have faced legal discrimination in some sense. So if you're thinking of First Australians or people from the LGBT community who have not always, if they've tried to access justice in the past, might not have had really great outcomes. And that can really lead to a sense of hopelessness and resignation and distrust. And so it's really important that lawyers working in this space are aware of that and create an atmosphere that's welcoming and that really sets the stage from ground zero to let these people know that they're welcomed in their service and that you're working for their best interests and that you're going to be advocating for them. It's also quite possible that people who experience high levels of marginalisation might just resign themselves to thinking, I can't get assistance, this is just what my life is going to look like, having a massive spur debt or constantly being hassled by the police. And so they'll just kind of slump their shoulders and I think that's it, and they won't look for legal assistance, or they might really kind of push back when you're wanting to assist them. And so I think, it's just very important for legal outreach providers to be able to navigate some of that resignation and some of that hopelessness. And it's also really important to understand your client's level of capability. So it's quite often that you'll be working with clients who don't have an extremely sophisticated understanding of the law or legal systems. As mentioned, they'll often face pessimism or resignation about their situation. They might be frustrated by the time it takes to progress a legal matter or to gain any sort of traction. And that can be really difficult, especially if you're working with a population that might be transient or that might sort of, due to mental health issues, sort of drop in and out of contact with your service. It doesn't take too many setbacks or too many delays for a person to become extremely frustrated and to disengage with your service, or to feel as though, it's taken all of their confidence and all of their willpower to even make that first engagement and to sit down with you. And then if you can't sort of show them that some progress is being made, then it's then they might just sort of disengage So it's really important to be able to build that rapport and to be able to sort of assure them that even if there are some delays, even if things take time, that you're going to be there with them, that you're going to be supporting them through the duration of whatever their legal problem might be. And it's also important to remember, I've just spent all this time talking about marginalised people and the barriers that they face in engagements in life. But it's important to remember that, like any lawyer, your job is there to advocate for someone, but also to empower them to make decisions about their own lives. And for example, I can think of a client at the homeless person's legal clinic who came down. He had quite a number of private debts. They were potentially debts that we could have helped him find some sort of waiver for or exemption for. But he said, no, I took out these loans. They're my debts. It's my responsibility to pay them. I want you to help me try and set up a payment plan. And, for a lot of people, particularly people who are on the margins, there aren't many aspects of their life that they might have control over. The public trustee might manage their funds. They might be in social housing or a boarding house where a lot of their life is managed. They might be living in a prison or some sort of other residential facility where they don't have a huge amount of autonomy, and being able to resolve their legal problem in a way that that they want is really important, just to make them feel as though they have some capacity to be in control of their own life. So I think I mentioned sort of those approaches there. Sorry, I'm conscious that we're getting towards the end of the webinar here, so I might skim over some of these last slides. But obviously it's really important to communicate legal concepts carefully to your clients by phrasing things in plain English, asking them to paraphrase your advice at the end of an appointment, paraphrasing what you've told them, what they've told you back to them, to be able to make sure that you're both on the same page, really reiterating things over and over to make sure your clients understand, perhaps offering longer appointments or checking back in with someone more frequently if required, and also using resources like fact sheets or workbooks to help explain legal concepts to a client and that they can take away for their reference. I've discussed throughout the webinar today the importance of outreach to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and communities, but I think it's really important to be culturally sensitive and to really understand the communities that you're working with, particularly with First Nations people, also with asylum seekers or refugees, or people who are from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. And it's not just a matter of taking a 2-hour CPD session over lunch. It's really a matter of being embedded in those communities and having a deep understanding of those communities. Our final note here is around trauma-informed practice. Obviously, it's a far broader topic to discuss in a webinar, and CLCQ have produced some incredible webinars on the topic, so I'd point you to consult with those for a bit more detailed information, and also the great resources that have been produced by agencies like the Blue Knot Foundation or No More. So that's it before we get to the questions, but I'd like to thank you all for listening, and also on behalf of LawRight, thank the amazing organisations and practitioners that let us consult with them in planning our best practice resources. You can find them on screen there. A lot of them opened up their doors to us to come and look at their services and how they operate, and that was really fantastic just an amazing experience. So thank you.
Alright, so if anybody has any questions they'd like to ask Kurt, please type them into the question box on the side of your screen. And while I give you some time to type, I'd just like to thank everyone for attending and also thank Kurt for a really engaging, great presentation. I certainly learned a lot, and I'm sure all of you listening learned a lot as well. So we'll just give you a few minutes to type your questions into the question box. Oh, and if you had any comments or insights as well, feel free to type them into the question box also. Kurt might have answered every question that you might have. He was certainly very thorough. Alright, well, if you do have any questions, feel free to send them through to me and I can forward them on once you've had some time to think through everything. And yeah, thank you everyone.